We're now in the third week of a sermon series called One, and it's about the way that the early church models for us what it means to be part of authentic Christian community. John got us started off with a bold assertion that outside the church there is no salvation, and asked us what we thought. I want to phrase that another way so that you can mull on that even some more. And it is just this: as humble as it is, as humble a tool as it may be, the primary way that God communicates with us now, both to provide for our needs, to help us feel God's presence, and to help us mature into who we are meant to be. The primary way that God communicates with us today is through relationships with one another in the body of Christ. Relationships that are intentional about connecting with one another and with God together. Where two or more are gathered in my name, there I am also, said Jesus. And it's still true today. We've been hearing these descriptions, and John said maybe they weren't just descriptions, maybe they were prescriptions, or maybe they were even aspirations of the life of the early church. Charlene read one of those passages today from Acts 2, and there's another very strong description of that community in Acts 4. And perhaps that model was a little bit of prescription, a little bit of description, but we listen to that and hear about the signs and wonders that were present in the early church, and day by day the Lord added daily to their numbers of people who were being saved. And it seems sometimes like it's just a different day and time, and that's not what's happening anymore. But I want to suggest to you that the signs and wonders that God would do among us, and I believe that God still does signs and wonders among us and wants to do them, may best be approximated or opened up by our relationships with one another in intentional community. Perhaps that's what we need to learn. Now, one of the characteristics that John talked about last week was that they were one in mind. And that did not mean that they agreed about anything and everything together, except this one thing, that they were somehow convicted that the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth had earth-shattering importance and something to say about what God was doing in the world, in their lives, and that it was important enough that they could center their lives on the hope that was born there. Today, we're going to talk about another unifying feature of the early church, heart. In Acts 4:32, it asserts that the whole group of those who believed were of one heart. They didn't just share a belief about the resurrection. They also shared their lives with a depth of heart. So authentic community is formed when people open their real selves to one another. I saw a neat little one-page article in, I think it's this month's Atlantic, and it's a report on a combination of studies by psychologists who are talking about small talk, interestingly. It says that psychologists have long said that connecting with others is central to well-being. We know that. But just how much conversation we require is under investigation. And so I don't know how I can't exactly picture how they pull off some of these studies, but one of them they mention in here is they had researchers who were eavesdropping on student conversations in the library over a period of 4 days. And then apparently they tracked down those students and interviewed them. And the researchers were supposed to keep track of how much of the conversation that was going on in the library stacks, we know it does, was just small talk about, weather, mundane, trivial things, and how much of it was talk about things that were more substantial, significant in their lives, relationships and things like that. And they found that the students who did more of the second type of talk, the substantive talk, were much more likely to be happier. About twice as much substantive talk among the students who were happier. I don't know how they quantify that, but I'll believe them. But still and yet, they went on to say and looked at some other studies and said, don't write off small talk and chit-chat because it's actually an initial way of people seeking connection with other people. And so I'm going to mention, I am always torn during the time before the worship service with, we have worshipful music, lovely music, we can center ourselves on God. But I'm also kind of thinking that it's music to hear people reaching out to one another and conversing and trying to establish a connection. It's a different kind of music. Maybe God is at work in both of those kinds of reaching out to God and to others. So small talk is helpful in trying to make the connection. And then they went on, and I hate it when research confirms something that my mother always showed me. But it's happening more and more. My mom was a bit nosy. She seemed like she was a bit nosy. She was always asking people about themselves. They came to fix the refrigerator. Next thing you know, by the time the guy left with the refrigerator fixed, my mother would know everything about his family, and sometimes she would have prayed with them, but she made connections with people faster than I've ever seen. When I was in the hospital for an extended period of time in 6th grade, I was doing pretty well. My mom spent as much of her time in other kids' rooms as in mine. And it was pretty cool because she got me connected and out visiting other kids too. She's really an amazing person. But my mom was one who could take small talk and kick it up a notch into substantial talk pretty quickly. And they said that the students who are more likely to be curious about others are able to do that. So if you're a decent small talker and you want to figure out how to make more substantial connections with people, just think more curiously about who they are. And apparently, that connects to our happiness. Well, so that's not related to God, right? But we shouldn't be surprised that God, who created us in God's image, in God's Holy Trinity image, should not want to be able to satisfy our human need for connection, and through that route also be growing us as Christians, maturing us, providing for our needs, giving us guidance. I think it's a marvelous thing. So, in this story that we have today of the early church, we see the authentic community being formed there. And one of the ways that it's described is they ate in each other's homes daily and shared food together and did so with gladness and simplicity. Some translations say that simplicity is sincerity or a lack of pretense. It's interesting, food really was by far a much more precious resource in the ancient world than it is now for most of us. Can't forget that there are people who are food insecure among us, but for most of us, food is not a scarce resource. In fact, maybe it's a little too abundant. And so when I started to try to help people translate this coming together daily and sharing food as part of the building up of the community of faith, and what that looks like today, because we're not looking at these passages because we want to recreate the early church. We want to take some of those principles and enflesh them for our time and place. So when I was asking small group leaders who are forming neighborhood groups to consider their context, I asked them to refrain from focusing on food, if having food at all. In fact, someone who was a very good hostess and a good cook, I said, really, you shouldn't have anything more than crackers and water. Why? Because for most of us, food isn't what is most precious that we have to share with one another. And I suspect that opening up our homes is not even quite the same as it was then either. And opening up our homes to share a meal together, people come into your space, they see how you keep house and what your routine is and your interactions with family as they come in and out. But we have this Martha Stewart overlay coming on to entertainment. And so the Martha Stewart overlay to me, now this is somebody who's a little natural, it feels like putting a layer of perfection on top of the world that you inhabit in order to let other people come into it. Do any of you feel like you have to put on your very best self in order to have people come into your home? And so I said, you know what? Meet wherever it's convenient. Just get together. Forget about food, because I think the most precious resource we all have today in our lives is our time and our commitment to being with one another and just listening. Now, on the face of it, we would think that the early church would have far more busyness about them. They, after all, didn't have any modern-day conveniences. So maybe our busyness is a little bit of an illusion, but I know most times I feel super busy and just trying to fit in one more thing. I don't know about you, we have lots of ways we can entertain ourselves, 150 meaningless channels on TV, and many other wonderful things we can do to entertain ourselves and our communities. So perhaps for us, the most precious resource is the time that we dedicate to not doing anything other than listening and being present with one another fully. So, perhaps we can learn from the early church a few other things. How many of you had parents who talked to you about your posture? I did too. I never understood why my mom nagged me about this. In fact, I thought it was because she wanted to box me in and make me uptight, and that's kind of the way it made me feel, until I started doing Pilates. And then I realized that when you have good posture, you're giving more room for your organs to expand, and you're creating better support for your core, and you can breathe better. And so we don't want to pretend, but there are postures that we can get out of our reading in the letter to Romans, postures that help us understand what's involved in authentic community. And the three postures that our book suggests, and I think are there, we can find them in the letter to Romans and in the description of the early church, are vulnerability, compassion, and grace. And I want to say especially a word about vulnerability, because I think it's probably, maybe in some ways, the toughest of the three for us, because in our modern world, we believe that independence is a sign of success and not needing anybody else, taking care of ourselves. Vulnerability. Vulnerability is about being willing to reveal our limitations our flaws and inadequacy, our growing edges, our wonderful, joyful things, our whole selves to others. We know in a different context that vulnerability is associated with having weak spots in our security systems that allow people to take advantage of weaknesses and to perhaps harm us. So it's hard on any level to see vulnerability as a good thing. And so I really appreciated a TED Talk that I watched this week by Brené Brown. And if you watch TED Talks, or even if you don't, I hope that you take some time. It's a 20-minute TED Talk, which is slightly long for them. And it is called The Power of Vulnerability. And it's a result of research that she did over many years. And so I'm not going to tell you when I'm quoting her. I'm quoting her a lot. But Brené Brown started out doing research on shame, this powerful experience that we all have at one point or another. And as she came to the conclusion of her research on shame, she said, I realized that shame is basically fear of vulnerability. So shame comes when I feel like there's something about me that if I let you know what it is, you might not want to be connected with me. You might not respect me, you might not value me, you just may not want to hang out with me anymore. We're vulnerable because we need connection, and we're afraid of losing it. And she said, so I saw this phenomenon of vulnerability behind the experience of shame, but she said the more I kept researching, I realized that there's this wonderful positive side of vulnerability. And I did not really know exactly what she meant until I kind of started reflecting on my own life, and it gave me insight into one of the most painful episodes of my life, which, in order to be vulnerable, I'm going to share with you. When I was in the husband that I bring with me here, that's my second husband. My first husband was a fine person. I have always valued being a dutiful person and doing the right thing, and I tried really hard to be a good wife. At one point, after several years, I just realized that I wasn't feeling anything anymore. I didn't feel anything good. I didn't feel anything bad. It's kind of miserable to never feel joy in anything. I didn't know really why it was. But as I started going to counseling, I realized that a big part of it was that I had a really false relationship. And so we started going to counseling together, and after about a year, it was clear to me that things had not gotten better. They'd, in fact, with honesty, gotten worse. I didn't know how to make it better. Nothing seemed to make it better. But I really do care about trying to do the right thing, and I was praying one day. I actually have this kind of fairly simplistic belief that someday we are going to be before the throne of judgment, and we're going to have to account for what we do with our lives. Our life is our one gift that we have. We're going to have to account for it. And fortunately, or unfortunately, I had parents who taught me right from the beginning, and everything I've ever done wrong, I've known I was doing wrong. So I said, God, I don't know what to do. I feel like I can't fix this. I want to be able to be happy enough in my home that I can be happy for my children. And just give me some guidance. And God doesn't talk to me often, but this time said, on that throne of grace, I want you to be there. I want you to be there. Nothing more. Now, what does that mean? I thought about it over and over again. I finally realized God wanted the honest me to to be there. Whether it was a failure, and it was a failure. Whether it was broken, whether it was not even knowing for sure if I'd really done my best. The real me wanted me to be alive, to be there. And God and God's grace would work on the rest. That was something I don't think I really quite understood until I started listening to this tape of Brene Brown's, because she said, you know what? When you're trying to hide your vulnerability, we do that by numbing ourselves and numbing our emotions. But you can't just numb the painful ones. You can't selectively turn off your feelings. When you turn off your feelings, your aliveness, you're turning off your capacity for joy. When you turn off being afraid of being who you are, being broken, making mistakes, admitting your failure, when you turn that off, you turn off your capacity for meaning and for growth and for joy. So vulnerability, being willing to be real with who we are. It feels risky, and it is. But it's what we're called to do for true community. Second thing, compassion. Compassion involves, if vulnerability means sharing our whole selves, all of our feelings with one another, compassion involves taking on another's feelings in order to share them together. Taking on another's feelings in order to share them together. Vulnerability means being able to open ourselves up, and compassion means being present to the openings that others offer us. And that's for the range of feelings, weeping with those who are weeping and having joy with those who are joyful. We really need to get to know each other's most important stories. And then finally, grace. Grace in the context of community most often means forgiveness and forbearance, but it can also mean humor. It can also mean just tolerance. And it's interesting now, the groups that have all formed at relatively the same time frame have met together, most of them 2 times now. First session, I check in with the leaders. Oh, it's great. We love it. It's wonderful people. They are all wonderful people. It is. It's true. Second session, not as much feedback. Now, third session is when I'm anticipating that people will go, there's somebody really irritating in the group or driving me crazy. That's when things get real. When we start actually rubbing up against each other's rough edges. And that's where real community rises to a challenge with grace. Love each other more. Love each other more. I pray that for each of us as individuals, in our own circles of community, that we experience the blessing of being fully alive to the world and to God. That is the result, the unexpected, not always guaranteed, but delightfully serendipitous result of embracing vulnerability, compassion, and grace. May it be so.